It's absurd. It's
Right?
unworthy of serious discussion. It takes 10 years to build a military establishment today. That just look at a whole decade. You've got to look at where we have been over the last 35, 40 years. Look at the military establishment you have, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that most of what we've got and the way we're organized to fight, the structure of warfare, the paradigm of warfare, all of that has changed. Now, who is organized and prepared to fight differently in the future from the way we fought in the past? Quick answer is Russia. Are we? No, we're not. We're a long way from that. It's going to take time. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when word reached Berlin and Vienna, Austria, in 1815, that Napoleon Bonaparte had landed, had come back from Elba, and was on his way to Paris, there were 140,000 Germans lined up to volunteer to fight in the Prussian army. They could not take all the volunteers that were willing to fight. The Austrians were experiencing something similar, but it was taking them longer. The Austrians have never been as efficient as the Germans. So they were going to raise an army of 300,000. Ultimately, we know what happened, Waterloo and that campaign and so forth, and Bonaparte never had much of a chance of retaining his position as it turned out anyway. But my point is, what was the difference? Everyone was prepared to volunteer and fight against another French invasion. Why? Because the French had invaded, they'd raped, they'd plundered, they'd pillaged. There was deep-seated animosity and antipathy, not just for the French, but for this man Napoleon that had unleashed hell on Europe for years. That doesn't exist right now in any of the capitals of Europe or in any of the populations. And this Russian army, if nothing else has become clear during this war, despite the lies told about it, this Russian army bears no resemblance to the Soviet armies of the Second World War. They have not behaved like the Soviet armies at all. If anything, they have a closer relationship with Tsarist Russia, which was hardly perfect. But, if you look at the Tsar, just if you looked at the Kaiser in Berlin, all of these people were humanitarians compared to the people that followed them. All right. So there's no groundswell of support to go against Russia. And this is going to become increasingly obvious. But you are going to see in Europe a groundswell of support for throwing out the foreigners. Getting the Ukrainians out is one problem. What are you going to do about all the Turks and Arabs and Africans that you've got in your midst that will never assimilate, will never become Europeans, don't want to be Europeans? In fact, they're there to change Europe into something that they want, as opposed to what the Europeans want. These are much more serious, and I continue to urge people, listen to Professor David Betts. If you haven't brought him on your channel, you should bring him on and let him talk to you about the potential for revolutionary change and upheaval in Great Britain. Because you can take many of his observations and you can apply them on the continent. It's not a perfect one-to-one fit, but it deserves attention. That's where the future lies. The future lies in the defense of Western civilization inside Western civilization, not in a war with Russia. That's just nonsense.
But as well, you mentioned that our armies are hardly prepared for a war with Russia. So again, having this direct war doesn't seem like a very good idea. But how do you think NATO will be reshaped after this war? Because there's two kind of hypotheses. One would be that will we now we woken up, we're gonna rebuild NATO and make Europe powerful again, or do you think NATO's gonna start to fall apart after this war is over?
Oh, I think it's already begun falling apart. It'll just become official in the months ahead. It's not something where all of a sudden we wake up one morning and the whole place collapses. It'll be a slow crumbling. But at some point, the buildings in Brussels, the buildings in Mons will be empty, simply empty. And the Europeans will realize, as I've said on more than one occasion, and I believe this very truthfully, exactly what Charles de Gaulle said. Americans do not live in Europe. Great Britain is an island. So where does that leave Europe? That leaves Europe to the Europeans. And the other problem that has always afflicted NATO, I shouldn't say always, but certainly for most of its life, is that the strategic view from Madrid or Rome is different from the strategic view from Berlin or Helsinki that is now part of NATO. In other words, the threats that are viewed and taken seriously in one area of Europe are not the same in other areas of Europe. What this really suggests that instead of having to herd all of these European states into one little or one large conglomerate, I think you will see regional security alliances emerge where there is truly a commonality of interest. It will be strategic commonality, cultural commonality, racial commonality, even religious commonality, because we know from history that race, religion, language, and culture, they overlap. They always have. It's not a perfect fit, never has been, but they overlap. So it's much easier for someone in Berlin to understand the perspective of someone in Stockholm than it is for someone in Portugal, in Lisbon, to understand the perspective of people in Vienna, Austria. These are just facts. So something else will emerge, and it needs to emerge at the insistence of or on the initiative of Europeans. Remember, Eisenhower said when we signed on for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, he said, if this exists in 10 years, we have failed. Because he saw the mission of the United States to promote productivity, prosperity, and peace. And he saw that as inevitably leading to our removal from Europe. Only we decided we enjoyed staying there. We saw Europe as part of our empire. In other words, we were like the Romans who looked at Greece and recognized that the Greek city-states were the foundation for our civilization, our way of life. That's the way the Romans viewed it, and they saw it those terms. Ultimately, the Greeks asked for their help to throw the Macedonian barbarians out of their country, and ultimately the Romans stayed because they said, we're here, we're not going back, you need to behave, stop fighting with each other, and become part of the Roman Empire. And so for the next 500 years, that's what they became, part of the Roman Empire. Well, today, we're a little more modern in our thinking and understanding of the world. There is nothing that we can do to rescue Europe in a total war with Russia other than to help destroy Europe. And I would argue that's been true since the 70s, because we never fielded the conventional military power that would limit the war with the Soviet Union to a purely conventional level. So at some point in every game, war game, exercise, there was a nuclear exchange. And you know what happened as a result of that? The war games ended because everybody understood, look, we just nuked Moscow. Moscow's nuking us. It's over. Look, we got to get out of this. There's no future in that. The Russians don't want it. We don't want it. The Europeans don't want it. I'm talking about the European people. They want to live in a peaceful, orderly environment. They want to be able to have their countries and live in those countries as they would prefer. They're not interested in being dictated to by von der Leyen or anybody else in Brussels. They don't want it. And they shouldn't have to put up with it. But they do need security. And each man's view of security is going to be a little different. And so I think you end up with regional organizational constructs that fit the needs of the people in a particular region. I mean, if you go back far enough in European history, go back to 1866, and that's why Bismarck fought against the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary. He said there's no better solution right now to the problems of the peoples that live in Central East Europe than the Habsburg Empire. He said, so we may not like it, but it's better than the alternative, which could be chaos. Well, I think you're going to have a similar conclusion emerge somewhere along the line among Europeans. What are we going to do instead of NATO? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is there's no one with any foresight or vision in Washington at all. So just write it off. There's no one who thinks in terms of what the future could look like and where we might fit in. Americans can always support and assist the Europeans in devising a different future, but we should not lead it. So if you were really interested, at least temporarily, suspending the dissolution of NATO, what should happen in Washington is very simply President Trump should say, we need a European in charge militarily, and we need a European in charge as the Secretary General. We are going to back out of those roles. That doesn't mean we're leaving 100%, but it means that we should not lead you into the future. Europe must find its own future. And that includes something other than NATO, a different kind of security relationship. But I don't see anybody in Washington thinking about that. Washington is a reactionary Austria in the 1840s, clinging to its empire, trying to beat down any opposition to change. That's what Washington is. Washington is not Prussia, and it's not Prussia-Germany. It is not the cohesive, stable state that Prussia-Germany was. We're more like Austria-Hungary now. We are a collection of minorities, and all of them are screaming for power, control, and influence. We're trying to manage that, which is about all that we can do at this point. But instead of coming to terms with what we should do at home, we are out smashing anything and anyone, anywhere, who seems to challenge our dominance, our hegemony. That's the problem. I mean, the whole fight right now, financially and economically in the world, is to preserve the dollar-based system. All the billionaires that surround Donald Trump right now and are dominating our political life, they have become billionaires as a result of this financial system that emerged after the Second War. Only we've moved from a productive capitalist model to a highly financialized capitalist model where nobody produces anything. We just move funds around and people collect transaction fees. That's how the billionaires became billionaires. And they're in charge. Now they're going to ride this horse until it drops, unless somebody steps in and says, you got to get out of here. We need Americans in Washington concerned about the survival of the United States and the American people, whatever that is now. We're not hearing much about that. Congress doesn't care. Everybody is out there trying to make money, trying to enrich themselves. That's why you see Marjorie Taylor Greene and others now talking openly about just leaving, because they see there's no hope. Everything is bought up. Everything's about self-enrichment. That's not a government. That's a going concern. That's a corporative entity that is sucking the life out of the United States. So I guess what I'm trying to tell Europeans, and I know a lot of Europeans listen to your program, is we're not able right now to step up and offer anything that's rational. That's the problem.